There we are. Thank you, Pastor. Appreciate that. I'd like to greet everyone that's there and see all your smiling faces. Only you look a little more distant than you normally did when I was sitting up there at the front table, but it's good to see you. And I'd also like to greet everyone who follows us on YouTube. You are special to us, to the people in this room who you may or may not be seeing right now. But here we are. And this morning, I would like us to turn our attention to Ephesians chapter 5. We'd like to begin with verse 3 or notice verse 3 and following this morning, but let's begin up with the first two, kind of get a running start at what we're going to be looking at today. Be therefore followers of God as dear children, and walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetous, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. For this ye know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be ye not therefore partakers with them. For ye were sometimes darkness, but now are ye the light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. For it is shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret, but all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light. For whatsoever doth make manifest is light. That's where I would like to focus our attention this morning. We look at those first two verses, and Paul is very tender with that wording. The children are dear children. He's asking us to walk in love. He gives us the sacrificial life that Christ lived and gave for us when he was in his earthly ministry. And then in verse 3, the boom is lowered with a bang. We drop from that almost a majestic height of example to the lowest forms of physical examples of sin that we can drag up from the depths. Look at these: fornication, all uncleanness, covetousness, filthiness, foolish talking, jesting, so forth and so on. Then you get down to verse 5. That no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. I want you to notice a couple of things as we've gone from verse 1 down to the bottom of verse 5. He starts up in verse 1 as children, and then he mentions inheritance in verse 5. This is a lineal familial inheritance. The right of the children to inherit from the parents is what he's bringing up. And as you see, there are two classes of children. But let's go up and have a look at what he's talking about. Now, this may be a little graphic for some, for which I'm not going to apologize. These are God's words and not mine. But fornication and all uncleanness. Let's start with that. Fornication is sex outside of marriage, period. Of any stripe, of any flavor, of any color, that's it. Fornication is sex outside of marriage. All uncleanness is anything that connects us to that, including thought life. And covetousness. Oh, this isn't just the fact that, boy, I'd really like to have what the Joneses have just parked in their garage in my garage. That's not what it's talking about, although that can include it. Covetousness is a grasping desire. It's a very real want for something you don't have. It's something that someone else has, something else is doing, even as coveting a manner of life. And look at this, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Now, this is the way it's taught, gives a lot of people a lot of problems with this section of scripture. So I'd like to spend a little time on this condemnatory part, because this is not only specific, it is also very, very inclusive. Let's take the word whoremonger. Now, after this word was translated into King James English, that word becomes pretty specific, and it means the business manager of a prostitute. It's the one who holds out another's sexual favors for money. At the time of the translation, it means more than that. It can include that person. Whoremonger can include that person, can also include the prostitute specifically, and anyone who patronizes prostitutes. It's that inclusive. And then when you get down to the unclean person, okay, in our own minds, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands or an attempt to answer this, but how far do we go with that definition of unclean? Which also includes thought life. It was Jesus who taught us that he who looks upon a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. That's where it begins. That's where temptation begins. It always begins in the heart, and out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaketh. The scripture also tells us that a man is in his heart, so is he. As he thinketh in his heart, so is he. So everything he's talking about here is a heart issue, beginning and ending with. But this is what I'd like to suggest for your consideration this morning and for the rest of this week, actually. And that is sexual sin. An observable sexual sin shows and demonstrates a governing spirit. A governing spirit. It shows, it demonstrates, it manifests a governing spirit. I see Frank sitting on the edge of his chair. Am I being unclear? Do I need to have something said again?
Just Jay, the word governing, my hearing aids weren't picking up that word. I got it.
All right. Okay. Sexual sin demonstrates a governing spirit.
Right.
And it's something under which we will subject ourselves. This is a choice. This is a personal choice. As you look at this wording, Paul is warning us not to do these things. That means the choice lies in our hands. He doesn't tell us to watch out for the guy who's going to throw this net over us. No, he's warning us, don't go in this direction at all. And I'd like to look at this business about uncleanness a little bit and couple that up there with that's very specific word, encompassing word of whoremonger. If you've been around for a while and you've talked with a number of people, you will find those who, on the issue of pornography, for instance, who look at that not as a sexual sin because they're not participating with anyone. Well, as you're old and wrinkling and growingly more forgetful language specialist, let me say, the basic meaning of pornography, the root from which we get that word, are you ready? Is whore writing. That's what it is. So when you get up to what that word whoremonger means, that is participating. Because conversation is two parts. There's speaking and there's hearing. Writing, there's writing, and then there's reading. When it comes to pictures, and we know how powerful pictures are. So that would be included here. Pornography is certainly included. And that gives a lot of us some problems because it says, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints. So what boat are we in, us poor guys who, from somewhere between grammar school and now, has cast our eyes across those pictures? Now, you have some people who will tell you, you were never elect. You're bound for hell and there's no way back. There's something I want to point out in the language that we have in front of us. And Paul is not saying that at all. Certainly not to these Ephesians, and through them, certainly not to us. It says in verse 5, and here's where, if you want to have a standing place, here it is. For this ye know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man, who is, present tense, an idolater. Notice that? Not was, is. An idolater hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Now, the fact that someone has passed from idolatry, passed out of it. And if you look at the Old Testament, you'll see that Israel did many times. They went into and came out. And Israel was, as a nation, may have been judged many times and punished many times, was never cast off by God. No believer will be either. Now, if you are a believer and you dip back into these things, which have been mentioned in these other verses, there is one thing you can expect. Well, two, actually. Number one, from your Father, you can expect correction and chastisement. And I will simply point this out. And I think that J. Vernon McGee may have said this years ago. I believe he did. God does not spank the devil's children, only his own. And is correcting because he loves them, because he loves us. Now, the reason I'm pointing out that this sexual sin demonstrates a governing spirit, it begins of old time, certainly long before Ephesians was ever written. Let's go back to the book of Judges. In the Old Testament, Judges 2 and verse 17. And yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a whoring after other gods, and bowed themselves unto them. They turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not so. Now, that went a whoring simply means prostituted themselves. They laid themselves open to other gods. These are false gods, as we know, but it's demonstrating a governing spirit. The one thing that Satan wants more than anything else is worship. In attempting to get it is what got him cast out of heaven, and he's never stopped grasping for it since. And he'll get it one way or another. Showing the governing spirit, and that's one that we will worship. We will render reverence. That's what he's looking for. And if one sees himself or views himself in bondage to one of these sins with no hope for coming out, see how he's got you? You're trapped. But along comes Christ in the body, and by 30 AD says very plainly, I'm come that you might have life, not that you're going to buy. I'm here that you would have liberty, that you would have freedom, the freedom of the gospel, not the freedom to do these things, but the freedom to escape them. We are looking at what is listed there in Ephesians 5. These are the things, this is the very kind of bondage that God called the children of Israel out of Egypt from. It was the reason that he had Joseph precede his other 11 brothers and his father down into Egypt out of Canaan. So the whole family goes down there because God tells them, look, the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. He took the whole family out of Canaan where they were living, the promised land that was given to Abraham, takes them down to Egypt, and there's nothing in the Bible that says that Egypt is ever going to belong to Israel. But down they go, and they were held safe as long as Joseph was alive, down there from what was going on up at Canaan. After Joseph died, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Egypt, and he enslaves Israel. We all remember that story. And they're slaves for 400 years. God comes down, I remembered my promise, and I've come down to deliver. He brings them out and takes them right back to the land that he promised them in the first place. He is demonstrating to Israel, through Israel to us, that he is, number one, able to deliver, and he's able to deliver from consummate bondage. And that's what sin is. Sin is the bondage of unbelief. It's not the things we do. It's what we believe that causes us to do those things. That's the sin. It begins with the heart issue. Let's go back to Ephesians 5 again and find our place. Verse 6. Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Now, we've just read where all this started back there in Judges. That's a long, long time ago. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. We are also told of this in the book of Ezekiel, the 16th chapter, beginning in the 28th verse. Same thing. You'll see it in Jeremiah, in the 3rd chapter, the 6th through the 10th verse. If you're writing it down, write those down. Jeremiah 3, 6 to 10, Ezekiel 16 to 28, and then of course Judges 2:17 that I quoted earlier. But if you will allow me, let's turn to the 106th Psalm. There isn't supposed to be anything condemnatory in the Psalms, isn't there? Isn't this Israel's hymn book? The 106th Psalm, beginning in the 36th verse. I believe it's verse 36. Well, let's start here. Oh yes, they're recounting the story of where Joshua takes Israel back into the promised land. This is the conquest. And it relates how they did not quite do what God told them to do. God said, you destroy them all, you kill them down to the last man. They did not do that. And it says that they did not destroy the nations concerning whom the Lord commanded them. This is verse 35. But were mingled among the heathens and learned their works. This is the people who had just received the Decalogue and the law. Now they go in to the land that was promised to them, and they take up the very works of the people that they had been protected from. And they served their idols, which were a snare unto them. Yea, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters. Look, unto what? Unto devils. False directed worship. There's Satan lapping it up. And shed innocent blood, even the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed unto the idols of Canaan. And the land was polluted with blood. Thus were they defiled with their own works, and went a whoring with their own inventions. This business of a sexual sin, which shows that governing spirit, is likened by God's own word to the very sins that the Apostle Paul, the physical acts that Paul is telling us to stay away from. And we don't have to wonder about the degrees of distance. How far away do we have to stand? These are absolute prohibitions. And there are those who will stand out there and say, well, you see, I've become a Christian, but you see, the Christians are against sex. No, they're not. No, we are not. It's like this. You find someone of the opposite sex and marry them, you can have all the sex you want. There's no restriction on that now, is there? There isn't. You get outside of that, then it becomes adultery. If it happens before you're married, it's fornication. That's prohibited. It's prohibited to them. It's prohibited to us. But we still have the ability to enter into sexual relationships that are true, correct, and right. And as the New Testament teaches us, that marriage bed is undefiled. If this is too graphic for some of you, I'm sorry, but I'm going into the Word of God here, not mine. Verse 6, we're going to read that again. Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be ye not therefore partakers with them. That word partaker, we would say partner. You join yourself, as Israel did, to those inhabitants of the land, the pagan inhabitants of the land. You become partners with them in their works, and you will be worshiping the same false god they are, even if you don't know it. That's why today, in the New Testament church, we must be very, very careful about false doctrine. It's spiritual fornication. It is spiritual adultery. Look in the Old Testament and New Testament how God has linked adultery and fornication with idol worship. And Paul mentions it here in chapter 5 when he says, for this you know that no whoremonger, who is an unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater. And I would say, as is, who remains an idolater. Once the gospel comes, I'm not going to tell you there isn't going to be a struggle of temptation against everything that's been named in here. But here, and people worry about that. When they should, I suppose, to a degree, be mindful of it anyway, in order to be careful enough. But Paul is telling us, if you are a child of God, there will be that struggle to resist that and to flee from it. There's no question about that. If you are not a child of God, no, there won't be any struggle. You'll be right at home in it. That's how you tell the difference. And we're not to be a partaker or a partner with them in that doesn't bother me anymore attitude. Because if it doesn't bother me anymore, it never did. You never were a child of God. But if it bothers you, and if you're struggling with it, then you go to the Spirit to whom you have subjected yourself, which is the Spirit of God, and you ask for his help. He delivered Israel out of Egypt. He can deliver you out of any bondage. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were right. Our God is able to deliver us. You believe that, he can take you anywhere, and his grace will keep you there. Unbelieving of that, you're going to stand stock still, and there won't be another step in your Christian life. That would be a great tragedy. I urge us all beyond that. Now look at verse 7. After verse 7, be not partakers with them. For, verse 8, we consider now, in conjunction with what's just gone before, you were sometimes darkness. He didn't say in darkness. He said you were darkness. But now are ye light in the Lord, walk as children of light. Now we get back to that issue of inheritance again, and that governing spirit. Now both John's gospel and his epistles tell us that God is both life and light. He is the source of all light. And when he said, let there be light, it came forth from him by virtue of his word. That light doesn't cease. It doesn't stop. We measure everything by it. Days, weeks, months, years, even lifetimes. And it says that you are children of that light, children of God. So you can assume there will be the struggle against everything that he's talked about previous to that. But there is a happy ending to that, because the light always comes back to God. My word will accomplish that toward which I purpose it, and it'll prosper there. And when he sent his word to redemption, and he is able to save us to the uttermost, that's a happy ending. For the fruit of the Spirit is in all goodness and in all goodness and righteousness and truth, proving what is acceptable unto the Lord. You ever sit down in your chair in the opening of the day and you wonder, I have several alternatives, door number 1, door number 2, door number 3. Which one am I going to go through today? Which one would be the will of the Lord? And you wonder what would be acceptable to him. Do you ever have those questions of wondering? You are the proof of what is acceptable, if in fact the light of God shines through you. That was his intention. You're not reflecting that light. You are transmitting it by the way you live and how you accept and how you proclaim the word of God. You are that light. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Now, if you are a child of that light, and he says we are, light does not bring forth anything other than good fruit. You're not going to have a peach without sunlight. You can have bacteria, and you can have all kinds of viruses that never see sunlight, and they will exist in it. As a matter of fact, light itself will destroy, what is it? Well, I don't know, maybe Bobby can help us out. I think the ultraviolet, which is contained in light, will destroy 95% of the bacteria on Earth. And as long as it's exposed to it, it's not only an illuminating thing, it is a cleansing thing, this light of God. And of course it is. And then it says, have no fellowship with the unfruitful work of darkness, but rather reprove them. It means expose. Now, if in fact you are that light of the gospel that you're living and that you're speaking in your daily life, you're transmitting what God himself gave us, and that was his own light. Now, we have just heard that light shining upon whatever it is below it will make manifest which works are which. Now we can see it. It's in the light. And those works which are darkness will be that area of people or of people's lives that do not reflect that light or do not accept it. Remember John's gospel, the light came into the world, and men loved darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. It's easy to see and judge if in fact you are light. If you're not light, you won't be able to tell the difference. Do you see the great need of the gospel at that point? That power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, that turns on the light. It's the only thing that can. Have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them, expose them. And that doesn't mean you're supposed to go out there and stand on the street corner and point your finger and say, you, and this, that. No, 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 no. It's to live a believing life graciously among those who know you, those who see you, those with whom you associate. Being true will expose what isn't without you opening your mouth. It reminds me of the story of the guy who he was high up in the Treasury Department, and I asked him one time, for the people who work in banks, you must have to school and school and school them on how to tell, a counterfeit bill. He says, no, we never let them touch them. Only original true stuff. That's what they handle. Then when they handle the counterfeit, they know it immediately. It's not the same. It's different. When the light which brings truth shines, it does exactly the same thing. It shows you what is counterfeit, including false doctrine. For it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret, but all things that are reproved, all things that are exposed, are made manifest, brought into and recognized physically for what they are, by the light, for whatsoever doth make manifest is light. I don't care where it comes from. I don't care who's singing it. If what is done and what is said shows the works of darkness to be what they are, that is light. I hope that's clear to you. I hope I'm saying it clearly enough. Now let's go back just a little bit, turn the page backwards. We're going to have a look at some of these things. Well, verse 4, for instance. I want to touch on just some of the things lightly before we leave this morning. But all fornication and uncleanness, I think we understand that pretty well. Covetousness gets a little more ambiguous unless you pull out our dictionaries and our thesauruses. Let it not be once named among you as become as saints. That's befits believers. We understand that. Neither filthiness. We want nothing to do with that. Nor foolish talking. Nor jesting. You telling me I can't have a comedy act or I can't watch one? Telling me we can't be in a jocular mood around a worship service? Is that what it means? No, that's not what it means. I'm going to point this out as clearly as I can, because this gives a lot of people trouble. And I think if you haven't been around a lot, you will find if you do get out, there are some churches where if you pull so much as a smile in the auditorium, you are well over the line. You're supposed to sit there. You're supposed to be somber. You're supposed to look like your face is supposed to look like your stomach hurts in order to be in proper worship. That's not what this is saying. What it's saying is you don't make light of what has just been enumerated here. You don't joke about those things because that makes it look less than serious. Doesn't mean you can't tell a good story. Doesn't mean you can't listen to a good story. Doesn't mean you can't laugh. It's telling you to laugh at the right things, scowl at the wrong things. I hope that makes it a little more clear. And be careful when you look at verse 6. Let no man deceive you. We like to think, and I think it was mentioned earlier about it's a little difficult sometimes because some people don't view Satan as an active spirit, that he doesn't really exist. Now, verse 6 doesn't tell us to look out for this roaring lion, doesn't it? It says, let no man deceive you. Satan has his ministers too. And Paul tells us that, that Satan can transform himself to appear as an angel of light. And it's no wonder that he makes his ministers too. He has ministers. You're going to get false doctrine and to direct false worship. It's going to come from a man. It's going to come from a man speaking. And this is where you want to look at me with a whole bag of salt. It usually comes from a man teaching. It may be over the pulpit. It may be over the lectern. It may be over Zoom, as we're doing this morning, but it comes from teaching. And that's why I adjure you in the strongest possible terms. Take what I say. I don't care what it is. and lay it up against that standard of scripture and see if it hews to that strict line, because if it doesn't, it's not good for me, and it certainly is not good for you. And if anything that departs, it's like any other angle of departure. The longer you stay on that angle of departure, the further you get away from perpendicular. The harder it will be to come back. Now, it doesn't mean that God is unable to bring you back. Oh, yes, he can. It just will be harder on you. It's not going to change God, but it's going to do some damage to us if it gets that far. Sometimes his chastisement can be pretty heavy, but it is always, always just. And behind all of that is his mercy. And if he wasn't merciful, he wouldn't bother. And I'm sure neither would we if we were put in that spot. Thankfully, we are not. Anyway, those are those first verses of following the first two of Ephesians 5, getting us down to the bottom of verse 13. We're coming up on your time, Rick, and so I will simply ask if there are any questions. I'll be happy to answer those. If there aren't questions, perhaps we could have Bill close in prayer for us.